Something is happening beneath the calm, and if you've been picking up on it, you're not reading too much into things. A significant decision is quietly taking shape inside them. And somehow, in ways neither of you may have planned or expected, your presence is threaded right through the middle of it. They might look composed on the outside, detached, maybe, going about things as if the weight of the world isn't pressing down on them from within. But a truth they spent a long time running from has grown too heavy to keep setting aside. This isn't simply about missing you. It goes deeper than that. It's about what this connection stirred awake inside them and what it has been forcing them to look at honestly ever since. They are standing at a crossroads right now, and no matter which direction their thoughts turn, they somehow circle back to you. For a long time, they kept themselves moving, buried in the routines of work, in the noise of everyday life, in the comfortable distance of pride and emotional unavailability. They genuinely believed that if they stayed quiet long enough, the feelings would eventually soften and things would become easier to manage. But certain connections don't obey that logic. The more they tried to push down what they felt, the more their inner world insisted on treating it as something unfinished, something real, something that refused to be quietly filed away. Now, they find themselves looking back at the story they told themselves for so long, and they're beginning to question it. Something deep is shifting inside them. Part of their heart is being pulled toward you with a pull that doesn't feel like a choice. It feels gravitational, almost inevitable. The other part resists because actually honoring that pull means dropping the defenses they spent years carefully constructing. It means vulnerability. It means honesty. It means letting go of the version of themselves that was built for protection rather than connection. They are finally sitting with their truth in a real way, wondering why thoughts of you keep surfacing in the stillest moments of their day, wondering why no one else has ever genuinely filled the space you occupied. This is the difficult and disorienting place that exists just before real clarity arrives. It's the place where the mind runs out of convincing lies and the truth begins breaking through. If they find their way back to you, it won't be because the path became simple or because the timing became convenient. It will be because they finally recognized that what existed between you isn't the kind of thing that simply comes around again. And if they ultimately choose to walk away, it will never say anything about your worth. It will only ever say that they weren't ready for the degree of honesty, growth, and genuine self-transformation that loving you honestly required. That's why your role right now isn't to chase, isn't to push, isn't to try to engineer the outcome. Let the truth move at its own pace. Let time reveal what no amount of words or effort could force into the open. What's happening inside them carries real weight. This isn't a brief moment of doubt that will dissolve in a few days. This is a full internal reckoning that keeps building. On one side of this reckoning, there is a pull toward you that carries warmth and memory and longing and a sense of belonging that they have genuinely never found anywhere else. On the other side, there is an old and familiar protective voice, one shaped by past disappointments, old pain, and the particular kind of fear that comes from having been hurt before. That voice tells them to stay guarded, to keep their distance, to prioritize safety no matter what it costs them in the long run. These two forces are pressing against each other from the inside, and the tension that's been created by that collision is becoming harder to live inside with each passing day. They might stay busy. They might fill every available hour with things to do and places to be. They might carry themselves as though none of this is touching them. But the harder they push these feelings down, the more insistently those feelings rise back up, because the real battle was never happening in the world around them. It has always been happening within them. That's what makes the next step they take so significant. You became a turning point in their life, even if neither of you fully understood that while it was happening. Something about this connection pressed against the walls they built to survive. It found the version of them that lived underneath the surface-level control, underneath the carefully maintained image, underneath all the layers of protection they'd accumulated over time. Now they are being pushed toward a choice that can no longer be indefinitely delayed. They can continue living inside the familiar shape of who they've always been, or they can step toward a version of themselves that requires something they've rarely allowed: genuine openness, emotional courage, and a willingness to take risks that once felt completely out of reach. This struggle is exhausting them quietly from the inside. You may have already felt it in the inconsistency they've shown, in the push and pull, in the moments when they seem to be edging closer, followed by the sudden retreats that leave everything feeling uncertain again. This isn't always about games or deliberate confusion. Sometimes it is simply what it looks like when someone wants a connection deeply but is frightened of the transformation that accepting it fully would require. As the pressure builds, the illusions they've been holding onto start burning away. They can no longer convince themselves that you are just a passing chapter or a temporary feeling that would eventually take care of itself. They're being pushed towards seeing you more clearly than they ever allowed themselves to before, and more importantly, they're being pushed towards seeing themselves with that same clarity. Old memories are returning with renewed intensity. Shared moments are resurfacing in ways they weren't expecting. Every silence seems to carry more weight than it used to. Every absence says something they can't easily ignore. This discomfort isn't accidental. Real decisions don't come from avoidance. They come from the moment when the fog starts to thin and the heart can no longer keep itself buried beneath all the fear it accumulated. That thinning is already underway, even if nothing on the surface has shifted yet. There comes a point when uncertainty becomes too heavy to keep carrying. They are getting close to that point, not because something dramatic has changed in the external world, but because the human mind cannot stay divided against itself indefinitely. For too long, they managed their feelings by minimizing them, telling themselves it wasn't that serious, convincing themselves it would pass, assuring themselves that doing nothing was a valid and safe response. But somewhere deeper inside them, that story is no longer holding. And what's breaking through in its place is rising with increasing force. Emotions this deep don't disappear when you ignore them. They grow in silence. They deepen during periods of separation. They wait with patience until the person carrying them can no longer pretend they don't exist. And now those emotions are returning, in waves late at night, during the quiet pauses of an otherwise occupied day, through memories they didn't expect to revisit with this kind of intensity. In the stillness that follows a busy schedule, they notice how naturally their thoughts drift back to you, without intention, without effort. Your presence hums quietly in the background of their everyday life, and no distraction has been powerful enough to silence it entirely. The things that once gave them a sense of escape are no longer working the way they used to. Your stepping back played a significant role in all of this. By withdrawing and not filling every available space, you left them alone with their own inner world. That quiet became a mirror. It forced them to sit with what your absence actually felt like. The missing warmth, the missing sense of ease, the particular emotional safety that only existed when you were present. When they finally felt the real shape of what was gone, they stopped asking themselves whether it had mattered. They started asking something much harder, whether they had waited too long to admit that it had. And then, in the honest comparisons that followed, the difference between what they felt with you and what they found everywhere else kept making itself impossible to ignore. Inside them, fear and desire have stopped taking turns and started colliding directly. On one side, a warm and instinctive pull toward you. On the other, the powerful and deeply familiar fear of reopening wounds that never fully closed, of losing control, of making themselves vulnerable again after the cost it carried last time. And yet, for the first time, the desire is beginning to speak louder than the defense. That matters enormously. It means something inside them is beginning to shift from protection to truth. It creates an inner storm that leaves them caught between moving forward and pulling back, between surrendering to what is real and retreating to what is safe. They aren't staying still because the connection lacks meaning. They're staying still because they are enduring a private war that is pushing them toward a breaking point they have never faced quite like this before. This has stopped being only about a relationship. It has become a defining moment in their own personal story. It's about deciding who they want to be and whether they are willing to live honestly with what they actually feel. If they seem more unsettled or more distant than usual lately, don't read that as an ending. They are beginning to recognize that living in the exhausting middle ground, neither fully present nor fully gone, has cost them their peace in a way they can no longer afford. They are being pushed toward accountability for their own emotions, toward a choice between continuing to prioritize safety or finally choosing growth. The hesitation that once felt protective has become a kind of prison. The walls they relied on are developing cracks under the weight of what they can no longer pretend isn't there. They are revisiting the moments they stayed silent when they wanted to speak. The times pride occupied the exact space where honesty should have been, the opportunities that passed because fear convinced them to stay hidden. The distance between what they feel and what they've actually done is narrowing. The gap is closing on its own, and real change is not just becoming possible, it's becoming necessary. When someone spends enough time genuinely alone with their thoughts, truth eventually rises above everything else. Above the distractions, above the excuses, above the carefully maintained narratives that kept reality at a comfortable distance. That is precisely what is happening inside them right now. The truth is no longer whispering from somewhere in the background. It is too loud and too present to keep ignoring. Every day that passes adds more weight to what they already know deep in the part of themselves they can't argue with. Every memory carries a lesson. Every moment of reflection shows them another piece of what they've been working so hard to avoid looking at directly. They are discovering that some feelings simply cannot be reasoned away. Some connections cannot be dismissed by logic alone. Some people leave an impression that no amount of distance fully erases, and regardless of whether they ultimately move toward you or continue trying to resist what they feel, one thing is already clear. They are not the same person they were when this started. The connection changed them. The silence changed them. The absence changed them. And now they stand at the edge of a decision that feels larger than any they've faced before. Not simply whether to reach out, but whether they will keep living according to old fears, or finally step forward into a version of themselves that values truth more than it values comfort. That is the real crossroads, and the pressure continues building because their heart understands that a decision cannot be postponed forever. The longer they remain suspended between two worlds, the more that suspension drains them. Eventually, something has to give. Eventually, clarity arrives. Eventually, awareness produces action. And as this unfolds, they are beginning to understand something they resisted for a very long time. The connection was never the problem. The feelings were never the problem. The real challenge was always finding the courage to face what those feelings asked of them honestly. That understanding is growing stronger with each passing day. And whether they admit it openly or continue wrestling with it quietly, the truth is working its way to the surface regardless. This isn't coming from outside pressure. It isn't being driven by anyone else's influence. It is rising from an internal shift that has been building quietly and consistently this whole time. They can no longer take shelter in uncertainty the way they once could. The connection has become too present in their stillest moments. It keeps appearing when the world slows down around them. It keeps returning when they try to direct their attention somewhere else entirely. And this repeated return is doing something important to how they understand everything. It's changing how they see the entire story of what existed between you. What once seemed like scattered and separate moments is beginning to look like a meaningful pattern. What once felt confusing is starting to feel significant in a way that carries real purpose and depth. They are beginning to understand something they hadn't fully acknowledged before. They weren't simply missing a person. They were missing the version of themselves that came alive when they were with you. The version that was more open, more authentic, more emotionally present and connected than they'd ever allowed themselves to be elsewhere. And the ache of living at a distance from that version of themselves has become too consistent and too heavy to keep pushing to the side. When someone begins missing who they became with you, the question stops being whether the connection mattered. It becomes whether they are willing to return to the truth that connection revealed inside them. As this awareness continues deepening, the outside world gradually loses some of its power to distract them. They can stay busy. They can surround themselves with people and plans and noise. But underneath all of that movement, there is still one quiet current running in a single direction, back toward you, back toward what was felt, back toward everything that remains unresolved. This is the point where the protective ego starts losing its grip. The ego wants distance and control and certainty above everything else. But a deeper part of them is beginning to understand that complete disconnection carries its own particular kind of pain, a hollow, persistent emptiness that no external distraction is capable of filling. Sometimes the loneliness of staying guarded becomes heavier than the vulnerability of finally opening up. And when that realization lands fully, it changes everything. They are now weighing two futures against each other, honestly. The familiar life they've always known, with all of its emotional limitations and quiet emptiness, against an unfamiliar path that carries genuine risk and exposure, but also the possibility of something real and meaningful in a way the safe life simply cannot offer. For the first time, that possibility is beginning to feel more valuable than the protection they spent so long maintaining. This is exactly where courage begins growing inside a person. Not when fear disappears entirely, but when truth becomes more important than fear. With that comes a quieter kind of stillness. The restless, frantic energy of indecision starts to settle. The pressure is still there, but its quality has changed. It feels more grounded now, more focused, more honest than it did before. They are no longer fighting every emotion that surfaces. They're beginning to let those feelings speak, beginning to accept that what they feel is genuine. And that acceptance brings something subtle but significant, not because everything has been resolved, and not because every question has an answer, but because the inner war is beginning to transform, slowly, into inner clarity. Direction is starting to take the place of confusion. Understanding is beginning to replace resistance. They are standing at the edge of an old version of themselves, looking out towards something unfamiliar that nonetheless feels strangely right. And the only bridge between where they are and where they could be is a single, honest choice. This is the moment of real self-reflection. The silence that once protected them is now reflecting them back to themselves with more honesty than they bargained for. It's showing them where pride blocked love, where fear created distance that never actually needed to exist, where avoidance was chosen when presence would have meant everything. They are revisiting conversations and memories and small, quiet moments from the past, but doing so now with more maturity, more emotional depth, more capacity for honest self-examination than they had before. They can see where fear made most of their decisions. They can also see, perhaps for the first time clearly, the value of what was naturally trying to grow between you. This isn't purely about regret. It is about reordering what genuinely matters. The things they once placed above connection, image, control, emotional self-protection, are beginning to feel hollow when placed beside the weight of something real. Something else is growing inside them too. Empathy. They are beginning to understand what their withdrawal actually felt like from where you were standing. They are starting to grasp the weight you carried while they stood at a distance wrapped in their own uncertainty. That kind of understanding softens a person from the inside out. It humbles them in a way that arguments and confrontations never can. It becomes harder to keep hiding behind emotional distance once genuine responsibility for another person's experience enters the picture. They are no longer simply reacting from fear. They are beginning to step into the role of someone who actively authors what comes next, more conscious of their choices, more aware of what those choices produce, more intentional about the direction they're heading. When someone arrives at this stage, everything takes on a different kind of seriousness. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just serious. Because they understand now that whatever happens next will be an honest reflection of the person they are choosing to become. The final layers of hesitation are dissolving. The old questions of should and could and maybe are losing their hold. In their place, something with much more gravity is forming, a sense of must. They must acknowledge what is real. They must face the full consequences of what they actually feel. They must stop standing still inside emotional paralysis that is accomplishing nothing but costing them everything. Time feels different to them now. More finite, more valuable, less like something that can be endlessly spent on avoidance. They are realizing that remaining stuck is itself a decision, and usually the most quietly painful one a person can make. This clarity isn't only happening in their thoughts, they feel it physically. A quiet pressure in the chest when they think about reaching out, a tightening when they imagine speaking honestly, finally. The unknown still frightens them. That hasn't gone away. But the hollow familiarity of remaining disconnected is beginning to frighten them more than the unknown does. And that is why movement is drawing closer. Words that have been held back for a long time are rising toward the surface. Actions that once felt genuinely impossible are becoming increasingly difficult to keep avoiding. Because when truth becomes this strong, silence stops feeling safe. It starts feeling unbearable. Hold on to this part clearly. Whatever they do next will not come from a sudden impulse or a passing emotional moment. It will come from the end of a long, difficult, and deeply honest process of finally meeting themselves without the shelter of excuses or avoidance. That is why this moment carries such significance. This is not a feeling that will simply fade with time. It is a reckoning, the kind that changes a person slowly at first, quietly at first, and then all at once when the moment finally arrives. At the center of everything is one truth that cannot be argued away. You changed something inside them in a lasting way. You reflected a part of their own potential back to them that they hadn't seen in themselves. You became a mirror, a catalyst, a fixed point during a season when they were lost inside their own uncertainty. Even in silence, that impact stayed present. Even through distance, it kept shaping their awareness in ways they couldn't fully shut down. That is why they are arriving at a deeper level of understanding than they have reached before. The noise is fading. The path is getting clearer. The question is no longer whether this connection affected them deeply. It clearly did. The question is only when they will act fully on what they now know. Layer by layer, the confusion is falling away. In its place is a grounded, quiet certainty that is impossible to argue with. They are realizing that trying to control these feelings only made them stronger. That pretending not to know the truth is no longer available to them as an option they can actually live inside. If you've been sensing this shift, trust that feeling. Something genuinely real is reaching its final stage inside them. It is asking them to decide whether they are ready to live from truth rather than from the fear that has governed so much of their story until now. Your role in this moment is simple but powerful. Stay grounded in yourself. Stay calm. Resist every impulse to chase something that is already being brought into the light by its own weight. Let them feel the full meaning of your absence. Let them recognize what your presence actually represented. Let them sit with the real cost of pretending to feel less than they do. The person who kept hesitating is approaching a line they can no longer cross back and forth forever. Their inner conflict is slowly becoming clarity. Their confusion is becoming purpose. Their uncertainty is becoming direction, one honest step at a time. Soon, one undeniable truth will rise above every excuse that preceded it. It will reveal who they actually are when life finally asks them for courage. And when that moment of clarity comes, it will prove something important. The quiet that existed just before the truth broke open was actually the most necessary and most significant part of the entire journey. If this speaks to something you've been carrying, hold on to it with patience. Trust what is unfolding beneath the surface, because the next chapter may be far closer than it looks from where you're standing right now.